Hello, I'm Susan Krumdijk, Professor of Mechanical Engineering, and you have found the Transition Engineering Podcast, where we talk about how to make the energy transition work. Hello and welcome to the Transition Engineering Podcast, where we talk about making the energy transition work. I'm Professor Krumdijk, back with you again, and I have three students today with me. Oh, actually two students, and Jeremy, who's been working for a while.
Hi, I'm Phillip. I'm 21 years old. I live near Munich, and I'm studying building services engineering here in the University of Munich.
All right. And Belen.
Hello everybody, I am Belen. I'm a Spanish student. I'm also 21 years old and I'm from Madrid. I study mechanical engineering.
All right. And Jeremy.
Hello everybody, I'm Jeremy from France. I'm 30 years old. I am a mechanical engineer and trying to make a better world, and so learning more about transitioning engineering.
Right, and Jeremy actually did his internship in New Zealand 6 years ago. And we were working on sustainability and having a good time looking at how to improve buildings for sustainability and really talking about transition engineering at that time as well. And the big topic 6 years ago, probably we would have been talking about peak oil a lot. And that's our subject today, is oil. And I'm going to do some history lessons for you young folks. And we're going to talk about really the key that we want to get to with understanding oil is it is really the linchpin for understanding why the future is not like the past. It's important to understand oil. So let's get started. Oil. We know that our use of oil is about 100 years old. 100 years ago, we really would have not seen a whole lot of use of oil. It was a breakthrough fuel at the time, about 100 years ago. It was replacing whale oil. People were using a lot of whale oil, but we had hit peak whale, and that was getting to be quite a problem trying to find any more whales. And why were people poking under the ground looking for oil? There was an article in the U.S. in a newspaper about, God has provided the light that we need from under the sea. Now we will look under the land. Oh. Yes. And sure enough, in Oklahoma, they drilled into the ground, and just like a whale spout, the oil shot up into the air. And there were photos of this in newspapers around the country saying, here we are. Now we found the solution to our illumination problem, because everybody was using kerosene, whale oil, and kerosene makes a very good lamp oil. Mm-hmm. And you can use it for cooking, and it was one of the first transport fuels. Mm-hmm. So taking a barrel of oil, the kind that squirts out of the ground if you punch a hole, taking a barrel of that oil and heating it up and basically vaporizing off the kerosene was actually a pretty simple process too. So oil was the answer to the problem of running out of whales. A little bit depressing, I suppose. But needless to say, Oklahoma and Texas, that middle part of the United States, during the period 100 million years ago or so, that part of the United States wasn't Rocky Mountains. It was a shallow, swampy sea. And it was a shallow, swampy sea for hundreds of millions of years. And it's in the middle of the country. Sort of all of this organic material from the dinosaur era is sedimenting there. It's sort of washing down into this area and forming huge coal beds, huge oil, this oil shale that we're fracking now. It's all, that's why there's so much of it there. All right. And so it didn't take petroleum geology very long to become a field. the geologists who understood, or as they were starting to understand, really looking at the past and what was going on in the past and figuring out what might be there now. And it didn't take them too long to figure out that there was a thing called an anticline, where the layers of rock have been folded upwards, and it sort of makes like a little dome. And the hydrocarbons that were buried 150 million years ago have been cooked, actually. They're down under the ground. There's a huge amount of rocks piled on top of them. And they've been cooked, made into mobile species of hydrocarbons, and they have migrated over the last 100 to 50 million years upwards because they're lighter than oil, and they've been trapped in these anticlines.
Okay.
So when they're looking for oil, that's what they're looking for. They figured that out pretty quickly, and guess what? You can see an anticline from the air. So by the 30s, after the First World War and the development of airplanes, the petroleum geologists started flying around the world looking for these anticlines and poking holes in them. And sure enough, there was a huge amount of oil out there. More than they could ever conceive of using, ever. And it was in between the 30s and 50s where really most of the world's big oil fields were discovered. And especially Saudi Arabia. You've got to have a couple things. You've got to have porous rock that the oil is actually trapped in. You've got to have the anticline, which is capping it and trapping that oil in there. And you have to have a place where it was really a sediment trap for tens of millions of years, where all of that organic matter was accumulating. So really at this point, the petroleum geologists do know where the oil is. And they're not looking for anticlines anymore because those have all been found. They're looking for more complex structures. Where there's been a fault that might have trapped some oil, where there's been multiple faults that might have trapped some oil. And even more now, if you notice, what has been developed the last few years, it has been what is out in the deep sea. It's what is in harder to reach places, and the stuff that hasn't been cooked. So when we're talking about fracking, this huge boom of new oil that's being found, it isn't actually oil as we know it. It is sedimented hydrocarbon that has not been thoroughly cooked. It has not migrated and accumulated in certain places, and it does not come squirting out of the ground by any stretch of the imagination. That's why it's called fracking. The other big disaster in new oil supplies is tar sands. So again, it's in that same area. If you think about the middle of the United States and Canada, this swampy, gooey area full of hydrocarbons. And it hasn't been sedimented. It hasn't been pushed down and heated. So it's kind of just this gooey, tarry stuff in the sand that it was deposited in.
Oh, yeah.
And so they actually have to cook it to get it out and to make something useful out of it. But it's really a tar. All right, so that's our history of oil, where it comes from, how it first started to be found. Of course, the chemical and process engineering field developed around taking that interesting hydrocarbon stuff and making it into different things. And the history of what developed to use that resource goes right along with the chemical engineering of what you could do with that barrel of oil. So mechanical engineering, we all know that the engines themselves have developed exactly with the fuel, right? You know you can't put diesel in a petrol engine.
Yeah.
They're different engines. They work differently. And yet, petrol and diesel, how different are they really?
I don't know. I don't really know.
I mean, as far as different, they're pretty much the same.
Yeah.
But the engine technology has developed exactly with the type of fuel you can make.
Yeah.
All right. So jet engines, same thing. They use a much lighter fuel than diesel. However, if you're in a really cold area, you don't use diesel. You put jet fuel in your diesel engine, and it will still work. All right. So the mechanical engineering, the chemical engineering, it all starts to go together. People are building giant refineries to handle the huge flow of oil that's being produced. And here we go with our question, what came first, the demand or the supply? I will unequivocally say supply came first. And then we figured out how to use it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, if you have no constraint on supply, then you will figure out how to build markets to use it. And the oil was a price-controlled commodity, especially in the United States, which was by far the largest producer of oil on the planet. Still is one of the major producers, but until the 1970s, well, even and beyond that a bit, it was the biggest producer. The United States was exporting oil to the rest of the world. And the United States got very good at all the things that you can do with oil, obviously, because they were awash in it. They had so much of it, they didn't know what to do. And the price of oil was controlled so that the different oil production companies didn't compete with each other in a way that drove the price so low that they would go out of business. Because there was another user of oil that was very important. Can you imagine what that was? The military.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yes, let's look for the reasons underlying. There'd been, the odd war here and there. And the world was not a secure place. Right? 50s, Cold War, 60s, Vietnam. And the military had to have access to secure oil. So the oil companies had to keep producing it. So the price was fixed so that they had a guaranteed price so that they could keep doing their thing. Well, if you're a company in a capitalist world doing your thing at a fixed price, is that where you want to be?
No, not really.
What do you want to do?
I want to raise the price.
Or you want to grow. That's your other option. If you're going to make more money and
Or
get
the same,
richer.
at the same time.
Yeah. If the price is fixed, then you got to make more. You got to produce more and sell more. And so that is what they did. You can produce more and sell more as long as somebody's going to buy more. So luckily, we had the American oil companies, or car companies. We had the American government that got into the business of building roads, big highways. And we had cities abandoning their electric trams.
Okay.
Yeah.
Every town and city in America had a tram. There were trains connecting every little town in America.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't believe me, Google Petticoat Junction. It was a popular television show from the 50s, I think, which everybody who watched that show would have known about a little town and the train that comes through twice a day and how that's sort of a link to the rest of the world and the interesting things that can happen around that. So there was this television show about that. There was also a television show in the same era about the Beverly Hillbillies. Did you ever hear that one?
No.
Oh, you guys need to Google so many things. Okay, so it was a television show about these people from the backwoods who struck oil in Tennessee. And so they got filthy rich, but they still lived like hillbillies, people from the backwoods.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was funny because they moved to Los Angeles, had a mansion, and did everything wrong because they weren't from that class. They didn't know how to spend their money. And all the people who wanted to help them spend their money, and yeah, they went on like that.
Okay.
So this culture of what oil did to the culture of the U.S. and to the rest of the world, really, is part of your history.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so embedded. That's the word we've got to use, embedded in our culture, that we use oil. We are oil man.
Yeah, we are.
Yes. And that's why in 1973, when there was a little bit of strife, there was a 7 Days War in the Middle East. I'm getting blank looks here again from the youngsters. All right. If you Googled that, what you would find out is that Egypt invaded Israel. That's not very friendly, is it?
No, it's not.
No, that wasn't nice. And the United States said, we're not up with that. And Europe said, hey, let's not do that. And Egypt withdrew. I can't remember right now what the provocation was or what was going on. Mm. But the fact that the West sided with Israel put off OPEC, oil-producing countries of the world. And they shut down the supply of oil to the West. And this is known as the oil crisis of 1973-74. If you ask your parents, youngsters, about the oil crisis, they will remember it because it was a big deal. The price of oil skyrocketed. The price of oil had actually the controls had been taken off a few years before that. Actually, a couple decades before that, because the production rate from Oklahoma, Texas, these places where there's this massive amount of oil, had started to slow down. Mm-hmm. Like I said, they knew where to find it. They found it. They pumped it as fast as they could. And so they started looking in other places, in California and farther north, and sort of looking around for other little types of reservoirs of oil. But to do that, they needed to spend more money. Yeah?
Yeah, of course.
Of course.
So they need to spend money for exploration. The industry starts doing a lot of things. Your handheld calculator, for example. Okay, young kids are looking at me funny again. There used to be a thing called a handheld calculator before computers that us engineers used to do our calculations. That was developed by the oil industry, Texas Instruments, because you had to do a lot of on-site calculations.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, to figure out how deep you were going, what the production rate was. Yes. Interesting. For example, there's a lot of material science that was developed around drilling, casings, cements. Yeah, this industry has produced a lot of technological innovation. And like I said, essentially the chemical engineering industry is about getting interesting things out of that oil. So, so the government had taken off the price controls so that the price could go up, so that the production could respond to that, so they could afford to look for more oil. Well, it turns out that in 1973, when the Arabs cut off the oil supply to the U.S. and its allies, it turns out that that was the year of peak oil in the U.S. The U.S. would have very much liked to have produced more oil in 1974, 75, 76, but it couldn't. And this is an interesting thing we need to know. Because the U.S. was importing oil at that time because its demand for oil had exceeded its ability to produce it.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a turning point.
It is a turning point. When you hit that peak in production, there isn't that much you can do about it. Since then, they have indeed, the oil industry has come up with ways to extract more. It's called enhanced oil recovery. They'll inject steam, they'll frack the structure to release a bit more. They'll inject carbon dioxide to increase the pressure in the reservoir to force some more out. They're working at getting the last drops out as hard as they can, and of course exploring for more in new and interesting places. But let's talk about the oil embargo first, because, again, like I said, your parents would remember it. And if you Google oil shocks 1970s, you will see some very interesting pictures of panic.
Okay.
Oh.
Of people lined up around the block to try to fill up their car. Yes. New Zealand had carless days. They would have a couple days a week where if your license plate ended in a certain number, you were not allowed to drive your car.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Germany too.
Yep.
We had a carless Sunday.
Carless Sunday,
Yeah.
all right.
So on Sunday you were not allowed to drive your car to save oil.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because all these countries are importing oil.
Yeah.
And it's running out. They don't have it. The filling stations have signs up. Sorry, no more oil. And it really caused a huge economic crisis. It caused a big spike in the price of oil. It caused what is still a political issue everywhere. How are we going to secure our supply of oil? It probably also led to the invasion of Iraq. It led to the unrest in the Middle East in general, because everybody wants that oil. More than 50% of the world's oil is in the Middle East. That's where it is. Yeah. And why they're on our oil, I don't know. It makes it inconvenient. So the oil crisis of the 70s, it really affected things. It drove the price up. And affected society greatly, and affected the kind of car that you drive.
You have to get more efficient.
Yes, and it turns out the Japanese had been making compact cars, efficient cars, and it nearly rolled over the American car industry because they didn't have that ready to go. They didn't have the fuel efficient car ready to go. The best they could do, Google this one, Ford Pinto.
Pinto.
The Pinto. It was a small car. Problem with the Pinto, if you Google it, you'll find out. They rushed the engineering job, as you do when there's a panic. And they couldn't figure out where you put the fuel tank because they're used to these giant vehicles they have. You know, the land yacht version of a vehicle. And so the place they put it, unfortunately, if you got rear-ended, you were likely to go up in a ball of flame.
Oh.
Yes. So, but they figured, yeah, okay, after a bit of carry on and reworking, American car companies have since then been able to make small cars. Mostly through partnerships with Japanese, but all right. So that crisis in oil led to a new era, mostly of higher imports in the U.S., but we also got the era of looking for more oil. So we got a big boom in exploration. Oil was opened up in Alaska, and this one is a really interesting one to me because in the 1980s. Imagine this swampy, warm planet that produced all this oil up in the Arctic. Weird. But that was the high CO2 world of 100 million years ago, where there weren't ice caps and there weren't really cold places. Everything was growing life and that as fast as it could. All right, so they got the oil fields opened up in Alaska and had to build a really, really long pipeline that is heated the whole way along. It's madness, actually, this idea that you're going to put in this pipeline to take oil across Alaska from the Arctic Circle down to Valdez, and then you're going to put it in giant ships, oil tankers, and sail it down to the lower 48 states and put it into your oil refineries. Mm-hmm. That is a lot of work to go to get some oil. Yeah. And that's nothing compared to what we're doing now, just so you know. So the oil comes down, and in the 1980s, we had another crisis.
Okay, what's that?
Well, it was the first time that what happened on such a scale that it really freaked people out a bit. The Exxon Valdez was an oil tanker that it turns out the captain was a bit in his cups, had a few, turned over the navigation out of the harbor to some underling, and they hit a sandbar and opened up the side of the ship.
Oh.
And one tanker's worth of oil spilled into the pristine waters around Valdez, Alaska. So the amount of destruction there is... You know, I mean, can you picture Alaska? Yeah. The waters, the orcas, the seals, the wildlife, the birds. It's a pristine, beautiful place, and it's ruined by this oil tanker crashing. Okay, well, now oil tankers are required to have double hulls. And we've only had a few oil tanker disasters since then, one quite recently. Really? A Chinese oil tanker went down, yes, in flames. Over by China somewhere. We've had, of course, quite a few ships that have wrecked, and the diesel fuel that they had to move them got leaked. And where are we in our story? So the 80s, Alaska's opened up. Mexico, that's offshore. We start to go offshore for oil. Now, remember where oil comes from. It's sediments that are carried into these shallow seas and the areas around continents. That's where it is. So that's why you can imagine that drilling for oil and pumping oil out under the ocean wasn't your first choice. You had to do a lot of exploration of new kinds to find it down there. And then there's a lot more risks. We've had these massive hurricanes that have come through the Gulf. The Gulf of Mexico is where there's a lot of oil being pumped out. There was a lot of offshore oil in California. That drilling was shut down after some big spills there that ruined the beaches of California. Here's a nice contest between who we are as Americans and our Beach Boys and our culture of California and oil, which California uses a lot of, but it's ruining the beaches. Oh, we can get it from somewhere else. We don't want the pollution here. So they actually shut down oil production in California, in the offshore of California. No more drilling out there. All right, so on we go with our story of oil. History of oil, because we need to get to the really interesting part. The petroleum geologists in about 2004 started talking to the rest of the world about something called peak oil. That this thing that has happened in every known oil field on the planet, that you have a certain amount of hydrocarbon in that rock structure. When you have gotten the first half of it out, you hit a peak. And you cannot increase production anymore from that oil field, and it will go into a pretty steep decline. That's how it works. And if you start looking at all of the oil fields around the planet and how many of them have hit that peak, then you start to see that we are pretty much down to the last really big oil fields in Saudi Arabia. And when they peak, the world has peaked. You can go looking for a bit more, but the oil that has grown the economy to this point, the oil that we use, the oil that at that point was $20 a barrel, that is going to peak and decline. And this was an interesting story that the petroleum geologists were telling, because they were just telling you what's happening and what's going to happen. And there's a phenomena that evolved around that, the peak oilers, which was, well, wait a minute, if we can't have more oil every year, then what happens to the economy? And if the price of oil shoots up because of that, what happens to the economy? And if that happens to the economy, then what happens to civilization? And there were people looking at that question. How high would the oil price actually go when you can't increase production anymore, when there's not extra oil? So let me give you a 2-minute explanation. Oh, I think it'll only take me 60 seconds of why the price of oil would shoot up dramatically. Okay, the supply of oil that we use for our cars isn't really about the oil coming from wells and from pumps and on barges and on trains. It's about the oil coming out of a refinery. A refinery is a giant factory. And if you're an engineer, you can imagine that that factory has to run continuously. It's heating up oil, fracturing it, splitting it into different components. And there's catalysts and there's all sorts of chemical reactions going on. And this whole giant factory is just flowing. You can't turn it up and down. The refineries of the world must have a certain rate of supply of oil. They must. And it is worth an awful lot of money for them to have that. And every oil broker on the planet knows that. So when the spare capacity in the world, the ability of giant tanker ships to divert and go to one refinery or another, when that spare capacity starts to shrink, the price of oil starts to go up, because every refinery has got to get theirs. So it isn't even that you need a shortage. It's that the ability to source what you need starts to become worth a lot. That's also why we see the price of oil shoot up really high, but not the price of fuel, because there's a few steps before it gets to fuel for you.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. All right. So in 2004, people start warning about peak oil, and that it looks like it could be between now and 2010 that Saudi Arabia can't produce more oil. And they start watching this, and it turns out Saudi Arabia is not producing more oil. The president of the United States says, Saudis, produce more oil, please. Price of oil is going up. This is bad for our economy. And indeed, the price of oil was going up, and it was bad for the economy. Because you're paying more for something that you must use, but you're not getting anything more for it. So it just drains the economy of cash. And if you drain an economy of cash, then you don't have money to fix your schools, or to pave your roads.
Yeah.
Yeah, or to fix your sewer plant. It's not going all that well. So Saudi Arabia didn't increase supply. There wasn't other supplies. And then there was an invasion of Iraq, which cut off some supplies. And we had, indeed, sort of the peak of the conventional oil production. And the price of oil, I know you guys were young when it happened. 2007, 2008. What were you doing then?
Yeah,
Going to school.
Playing some
riding
soccer,
my bike,
riding your bike.
Yeah, playing some soccer, riding my bike to my friend's house. Yeah.
Well, the price of oil went from $20 a barrel to over 100,
Over 100.
and it got up to 140.
Oh.
Right. That was basically the instigator of the Great Economic Recession around the world. And okay, so that wasn't a good thing because it toppled over every other bad financial idea that anybody had ever come up with, right? Because you can do financial deals that maybe are a bit risky, and that as long as everything just keeps growing. And when you suck $800 billion out of the economy to pay for oil that is not doing anything else for your economy, then you run out of cash to spend on anything else, and all of your dodgy deals collapse, and your inflated price of your houses collapse. And there we go down the tubes. All right. So it's actually quite possible that the warning about peak oil was true, that this was going to be a big mess.
Yeah.
The inability to increase supply was going to be a big mess. Okay, so we're still here, and we are still using, in fact, slightly more oil than in 2008. There was definitely a flattening off of oil demand and a slight decline. But today, ta-da, 92 million barrels of oil a day.
It's a lot.
World consumption. Yes, it is a lot. So if you think about what we're talking about for the future and why making the transition of energy work, we are talking about what the heck would we do so that the next time we start to get this squeeze on the spare capacity around the world to feed the world's refineries, and we get that next big surge in price, that it doesn't wreck the world economy. Is that possible? We don't seem to be prepared for that because we're back where we started. And the boom in oil supply that we're looking at now is from things like the Gulf of Mexico, where you guys might remember the Deepwater Horizon disaster. That wasn't so long ago.
Yeah. I remember it.
That makes the Exxon Valdez look like a drop in the bucket. That was an unmitigated complete disaster. That's deep sea oil drilling. That is the sound of the straw sucking the last bit out of the bottom.
Yeah.
And now the environmental disasters that are going along hand in hand with our 91 million barrels a day as the conventional supplies are declining. We're talking about fracking. We're talking about tar sands. We're talking about everybody scrambling to get into the Arctic. We're talking about opening up wildlife refuges, marine reserves, under people's homes in Colorado in the United States about 2 or 3 years ago. One of the fracking lines leaked, accumulated gas in a house and blew up 3 people. We're talking about really broad spectrum environmental disaster to keep that thing going. And that, when it tips over, is going to, of course, cause another one of these little shocks. And the question of the day is, what do we do about that? All right, thus you get the reason for transition engineering. This is the portion of the podcast where I try to convince you to take action. Do you remember the first time when you became aware of global warming and the climate change issues? If you remember that, try to think about what that was like. Who did you talk to about it? Was this the sort of normal conversation that you would have with friends? Would you bring it up in school? Was it taught in your university classes? I think it's kind of interesting how difficult it is to talk about this global problem with your ordinary, everyday colleagues. If you feel that way, then joining the Global Association for Transition Engineering might be a good idea. The job of changing the engineered systems that are causing the problem is the job of the engineers who know those systems. It's just a normal part of the job, and we need to normalize it. That's what GATE is about. And I hope you'll join us in our conversations and at our website, www.transitionengineering.org, and help us getting busy on doing this job.